Are you new to the violin and curious about some of the more common finger patterns violinists and fiddle players use? Well, you've come to the right place. Today I'm going to be showing you 3 of the most commonly used finger patterns on the violin. Now, let's talk about finger patterns. Before we get into our discussion, it's important to know how we talk about finger spacing. Every finger pattern we use relates back to a scale, and we use the term whole step for notes that have about a finger's worth of space in between, and half step for notes that have no space in between. We'll start with what I consider to be the most common finger pattern for beginners and go from there. All of these finger patterns I'm about to show you can be used on all 4 strings, but I'll be demonstrating on the A string. So the first finger pattern we have is the A major finger pattern, and this is where we have a whole step between our first and second fingers and half step between our second and third fingers. And the reason we call it A major is because it refers to the A major scale. This is the same finger pattern we use within that scale on the A string, and it's one that you might be familiar with if you've learned songs like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And when you're first starting out on the violin, this is the finger pattern that will show up most often. Okay, and our second common finger pattern is the G major finger pattern, and it relates to the G major scale. It's the same pattern that we use with that one on the A string. And for this one, we have a half step between our first and second fingers and a whole step between our second and third fingers. So it's just basically the reverse of the A major finger pattern. This one is very common when you start getting into tunes and songs that are in the key of G major, but if you're used to the A major pattern, it might take a little bit of getting used to lower that second finger. And lastly, we have the E major finger pattern, which is the most challenging of them all, but still very common on the violin. It's one that we see show up in the E major scale, but not only in the E major scale, just like with these other finger patterns, of course, they show up in multiple scales. But for this one, we have a whole step between our first and second fingers and another whole step between our second and third fingers. So this is the most difficult one because of the spacing of that third finger. Sometimes for people, it can be a little bit tricky to reach high enough to get that note. In this case, it would be a D sharp on the A string. So just be careful with that third finger, especially if you're practicing this pattern. So those are the 3 most commonly used finger patterns on the violin. I really hope you enjoyed this video and got something from it. Let me know by leaving a comment below if you have used any of these finger patterns before. If you have a favorite one, I would love to hear from you. And until next time, happy practicing.